Now in segment 2, we're going to look at what is happening on the overall, U.S. product supplied. And again, this is product supplied. So it's implied demand based on the product being moved into the market. If people don't buy that product that week, or they buy it the day after this data is reported, you're going to get an underwhelming number, which again is going to snap back. And you can see when you look at 2021, we had dips. When you look at 2019, it dipped at the same time. When you look at 2021, it dipped at the same time. So in 2022, we had a big drop. But again, it didn't mean it was going to be permanent. It just meant that there was some shortfall. But when you look at the average, and that's what we keep coming back to, the average continues to sit at about 14.4 million barrels. Now, the last week we were at 14.345 million barrels a day. Now we're at 14.8. Again, we're still below 15 million barrels a day. And that's what we've been saying, is that we thought we were going to average 14.9 million barrels a day, just below 15,000. Here you can see that we are off by about 300 to 400,000 barrels a day. That's a mixture of gasoline demand is about 150,000 below what we thought it was going to be. But realistically, the biggest delta has been diesel. When you look at the diesel data, it has come in much weaker than what we believed. We thought it was going to stay at about 4.2 to 4.3 million barrels a day. Instead, it is averaging something closer to 3.9. So if you take the diesel and the gasoline side, that's where we're getting, instead of being at about 14.9, we're sitting at about 14.5. Once this new number is factored in, that's where you're getting this kind of comfort, the number. And one of the things that we've talked about is in 2021, you had gasoline that remained lackluster versus historics. But you had diesel that was running so aggressive versus where it normally is. But now you have gasoline that remains a bit depressed, about 600,000 barrels a day against the normal. But you have diesel, which is, I'm talking significantly off of 2021, still above where we were, in terms of 2017, 2018, but that's going away. That's normalizing. That's coming back down. So between the adjustment in diesel and the adjustment in gasoline, that's where we're coming in at this fairly low number, as jet fuel continues to be well below the quote unquote normal from 2019, where even that was slightly weakening just because of the economic pressure that we've seen. Now, for those, we didn't have the YouTube channel in 2019, but I was writing about it. So for those that were getting the insights, there was no surprise that 2019 was a very weak year, especially Q4, which is why we were well positioned in December of 19 as we went into March of 2020 in terms until the good old J-Pow decided to bail us out. So Americans, this is the EIA cuts full year 2022 consumption forecasts after weak demand in July. Again, this is looking at June, July in terms of what we've seen. So the 2021 forecast, the actual, if you look at Q3, when you look at the assumptions for July, August, it went from 9.1 to 9.03 to 8.9. So again, we think that we're at 9.1, and you can see in Q4 they've actually increased some of the consumption from an estimate of about 8.94 to 8.97. So full year sitting at about 8.83. So again, there hasn't been a whole lot of movement. I mean, we're looking at fairly things that are measured in the tens of thousands, not even the hundreds of thousands. But again, as we close out the summer, 9.1 million is what we believe this will continue to hit. It'll be lumpy going through. Don't worry, it's just a lumpy number. It's not something where they're lying in order to drive down price. It's just the nature of the game in which we're playing. So when you look at distillate stocks, there was a build of 2.17 million. That's still 34.4 million below the 5-year, with the lion's share of that, again, pad 1. Small build of 270,000 in pad 1, but over 23 million below the 5-year. Pad 2 also remains light at about 6.9, but Pad 3 had a build of 2.17 million, and that's fairly stable for where we are, just given that's where the 2020 numbers kind of skew things a bit. But again, Pad 3 is fairly normal, but Pad 2, Pad 1 still has some potential upside when you look at just pricing and just the economics of it. Imports remaining elevated. They dropped to 29,000 barrels a day, but it's still 54,000 above the 5-year. And again, Pad 1 is going to absorb whatever it can as we continue to see product coming in from the Middle East as well as Asia. And then it competes into the Atlantic Basin of, does it go to Europe? Does it go to the U.S.? But there's also the issues with the Rhine, which we'll talk about in a minute. So then when you look at Disti, here you can see just how low we are versus historics. You know, when you look at that dotted line, that is the 29-year average. So you get an idea of how low we are, just again, factoring in I think it's all but 2 years is what we're at. And just again, looking at the rate of change, we're just going sideways. We're not closing that gap. Continue to see a lot of problems with obviously the lion's share of it being in Pad 1, where instead of seeing those increases, we're just remaining flat, and we're just struggling to get and see some of that increase, which again, we don't see changing, which is going to put us in a very tough problem. So for those that look at inflation and look at the data month over month, year over year, where there was not much growth in the inflation month over month, I think this is what should give you pause, because this is heating oil. This is the energy that people are looking at. Then you look at natural gas, which is approaching $9 again, which is going to drive up electricity prices, so yes, gasoline has gotten cheaper for the consumer, but energy as a basket is not getting much cheaper. And when you look at everything outside of energy, all prices still went up. So you're still getting an increase in inflation. Yes, the rate of change has slowed, which is what we called for. The rate of change was going to slow, but we don't see that deflation until we get into next year. Then when you look at Pad 3, again, things, you can see just how skewed 2020 makes things. Fairly in line, not too much to say one way or the other. Again, they're trying to manage this based on what goes into the export market, what gets consumed locally, and we don't see much adjustment as demand continues to be below that 5-year average. And remember, the 5-year average is also skewed because of end of 2020, 2021. So I'd say it's closer to normal. But as you can see, just based on the new metrics, we believe that we're going to stay below the 5-year average. And again, at the bottom of the cloud, all driven based on trucking. So you can see that the pace has slowed, but it's still a decline. And now we're back to the highs from 2018, and really the first peak in increases in 2020 when you had the March drop, and then April, May, you had that first spike. So we're back to the high of that first spike. Still elevated when you look from 2014 through 2020, the first half of 2020. But again, as you start to see that, and this is where we see that leveling off, where you're still going to have more activity because you still have some of these shortages, but the shortages are getting fewer and fewer and far between. And that's where we're going to continue to see some of this pressure, especially as we get into September. But we normally start to get a tick up in September for Christmas. So the question is going to be, how big is that tick up? And do we continue to move down? Because the retail side, we've seen the consumer slow, we've seen inventories build, so there might not need to be the same type of bump that we are used to. Rail traffic, not much to report here. It's pretty much in line with what we said. Grains remaining strong, coal remaining elevated. When you look at just intermodal, right around 3% below last year. Again, we just don't see much adjustment from these numbers and from these, from these specific data sets based on what we've seen and what a lot of the leading indicators have been saying. Now, when you look at what's coming into the U.S. on the port side, again, giving us some of that confidence that we're talking about in terms of rail, in terms of trucking, you can see that we're still well off of last year, but still elevated. Yes, last year was a massive year. So to be 8% for next month, for next week against last year, you're still above what you were in the normal period. But again, the trend continues to move lower as we start to catch up, as inventories normalize, as retail consumers slow. Again, that's going to have that self-fulfilling process as we go through that back end. On the temperature side, and this is a yay for us in the Northeast, you're starting to get a little bit of a, near normal, below normal. So again, we're moving into August. August can be a bit lumpy, where you have those heat during the day, then things cool off at night. But then when you look at the West Coast, things are getting hot and above. Same with the South. So you will get, realistically, you're kind of going to get a normal natural gas burn. So we don't see much, especially now that we're back near $9. We don't see much change from this point. Gasoline stocks, we had a drop of that 4.98 million. Against the 15 average, that's 15 years below. But again, it's all driven by Pad 1. Pad 1 is down 13 million barrels below the 5-year. Pad 3 is still above by 1.9, and that's including, again, 2020. So when you look at this, one of the things that we thought was going to be, the steady state in general in terms of slight, increase, decrease realistically. But I think I should have clarified by saying when you look back and you get that average, you're still going to have that lumpiness. But when you take that smoothing line in terms of that dotted line, which is that 29-year average, you can see it's that smooth decline. What we're saying is that we're just going to get this smooth sideways number. So if you were to average them out, we're just going to get this very sideways number, which is going to make the comps much easier, because even the top end of the cloud, you can see moves to the downside, not so much a 45-degree angle, but more of like that 30-degree angle to the downside until you get to the middle of October, and then you start to get those increases. So when you look at imports, imports remain down. They fell versus the 5-year, 358,000 barrels a day versus the 5-year. It fell 16,000 below, week over week. Pad 1 had a small increase of 67,000 barrels a day, but when you look at the arb remains closed and or starting to open a little bit, but we're going to talk about that in a second, because you're starting to see day rates remain very elevated for tankers. And now when you look at the Rhine River and the issues that are happening with the Rhine, given the record shortfall in terms of water, levels are dropping, which is impacting the amount of product that can move. Not only just the amount, but also how much they can fill it, with parts of it actually being shut down. So then when we start looking at the blending components, which, as we said, was a key component, when you look at the blending side, you can see the blending will drop 5.16 million barrels. It's still only 10 million below the 5-year, but again, that's where that is indicative of, which is what we were talking about when we look at ethanol. You look at blending components, you're starting to get within that 9.2 million barrels a day, which is still below what is normal for this time of year, but above normal for the rest of the year, because we are in peak driving season. So the question is now going to be, where do we end up as we continue through into September, October? And that's where we expect to see a bigger decline than normal against the seasonal averages, just because you have some of that hindrance from spending. Yes, gasoline prices have come down, but everything else remains expensive, continues to get expensive. And with crude rallying back, that's also going to kind of put a floor on where some of these gasoline prices are and keep people a little close to the vest. Congestion in China finally reversed some of the course, but now we're getting a word of some additional lockdowns, which is going to pull us back down, continuing to be a bit of an overhang in China. But Europe is slowing again. So when you look at Europe, you had a little bit of that bounce. Now you're coming back down. And in the Americas, again, that flatlining right at this level. And this is, again, looking at just Google mobility data. Google mobility data is just showing you that we're about 6 to 7% off of normal. In Europe, we're about 5 to 4% below normal. So again, if you can look at a 5 lanes of traffic and immediately say, oh yeah, I see the 5%. You're a better man than me. I can't, 5%, what is 5%? So if I'm on the LIE, instead of being in stop and go traffic, am I moving at 8 miles an hour instead of 5 because there's 5% less cars? Does that mean that it's hard to gauge because everywhere they're still doing construction? So I'm in traffic, but I was on 95 the other night and last night, and we had 4 lanes going to 1. So I was in traffic. Would it have been worse if that 5% was there? I can't tell you what that looks like, which is why I try very hard to again, not do anecdotal and just show you the data. TomTom shows that Europe continues to weaken, and you can see that big drop off. So typically TomTom, because the Google Mobility Index is a 7-day moving average, TomTom's a 5-day weekday moving average. So again, TomTom's a bit of a leading indicator, which is showing some of the weakness in Europe, but you're seeing some of the recovery in the U.S. or the Americas, and some of that slowdown in Asia, which is again consistent with what we're seeing in the Americas. You get that last push. This is the last week of vacation for some, so this is a big vacation week, and then things start to get back to normal next week, where Europe and Asia Pacific are showing more pressure to the downside, which we've also seen out of Fujairah. Gasoline and diesel prices. Here you can see that diesel prices are just back to where we were to start off the year, just a round trip. You can see gasoline prices are actually below that previous high. As we've said before, we think diesel has more staying power here versus gasoline, due to storage, due to the issues that we've talked about. And that only gets worse as people turn on their heat, and heating oil competes with road fuel, road diesel, which is going to keep that where we think gasoline levels off. It still is going to fall, but again, the rate of change is going to flatline. And remember, as we get into Labor Day, you can switch off of summer grade, and that will again, winter grade is cheaper to make than summer grade, which will also bring down some of those prices. Now, it's important to look at those blending components. And again, you can see that we normally have these draws at this point in time. If you take out that big 2020, you can see that we're fairly comfortable with where we are. And if you kind of put in your mind's eye where we are, petchem struggled. So refiners are trying to minimize gasoline, blending components, and maximize disti. So again, it's important to look at the equilibrium with what the goal is for the refiner. Then when we start looking at, again, that demand, it's important to, as we said, July 4th we thought was going to be the peak. And it's not that we weren't going to get back close to it, but it's just that was the peak. That was when you have you had a long weekend. That's the beginning of the core of the core. When for those in energy that love that term, for driving season, because typically from that point until about August 15th is when you have the most kids off, most schools off. And that will, again, as we've said, start to come down. But even with this spike, you can see just how far we are from normal. And it's just, this is the elevated period. Then you see that we normally kind of get a slowdown into the end of the year. And we just think that that's going to continue to be the case in general. Here's looking at U.S. Google mobility data specifically. You can see transit, workplaces slowed a bit, grocery stores, retail, all kind of rolling over a bit. And we don't see that changing all too much. Propane, propylene, steady as she goes, a build of 2 million, but still 6.4 million below the 5-year. And you can see we're just tracking right at the very low end of that number. Jet fuel, draw of 970,000 barrels. It's just 0.5 below the 5-year, so not too much to say one way or the other. You can see that we're above where we were in 2021, which is the green line, but below where we were in 2016. We just see us that 1.5, averaging 1.45, 1.55, and staying within that level, especially as we go into the end of the summer, which you can see that we typically get that drop off. And you can see it's already starting where you're going to get lower lows, lower highs, just in terms of things continue to drift a bit lower. It'll be above 2021 levels, but below 2019, again, filling in that gap. And then it levels off as we get into September. And again, there's just very seasonal, just directly below, and just putting into kind of context where that is. The flight schedules are starting to reflect that. So now flight schedules ahead are 0.8% lower. Typically, as we've been saying, it's been about 0.2, 0.3% lower. Now we're at 0.8, and that's just, again, seasonal. Like there's nothing in this that is not seasonally normal, just at a reduced level, and that's something that we see continuing into the end of the year. Open table. When you look at the data in general, we're still about 1 to 3% above normal, and that's just being driven based on Ireland when you look at Europe. But when you look at the U.S., has actually been just below or just above, averaging probably about 3% below average. And that's just, I think, something that's hitting a bit harder when you look at the inflation side and people not eating out as much. And we do see that hitting in other areas as well. But you also have to remember that other areas of the world were much stricter on food when you look at 2020 and 2021 numbers. So the base effect is a bit different. So I think that's why it's important to put that into perspective when you use this to try to say, well, spending's actually fine. It's like, well, it's not. You have to normalize the numbers. It's still up. I'm not saying it isn't, but again, there's more pressure to come in that market. So that's what we have for you on the demand side, starting to drop off as we get into not so much next week, but the week after, when you start to get the full impact of people being back at school. Especially, I think it's about 60% of America goes back to school starting, just to pull up the exact date, you have it picking up either the 16th or 15th through 17th is usually when you start to have the first day of school. And that, again, is going to be where we should start to see some of that drop off. So that's what we have for you on here. Next segment, we're going to go abroad, look at what's happening in the international market and some of the pressure points that we've seen on the refined product demand side.